Hi friends, today we are going to learn about object oriented programming language. So, OOPS concepts, that means programming approaches. What are the type of programming approaches? And we will understand basic and overview of the object oriented programming system. Here we can see here first one is programming approaches are two types. One is procedural oriented approach and object oriented approach. Here programming approaches, that means whenever we are in project, whenever we are writing a program, while writing the program we need to follow two approaches. Obviously whether you are following or not, but the way of approach will be in two approach, whether you are following either procedural oriented approach or object oriented approach. So basically we have two approaches. One is procedural oriented approach and object oriented approach. Then we will go to the procedural oriented approach. That means in procedural oriented approach, program is a collection of procedure and methods. That means in procedural oriented approach is containing procedures and methods. A programming language which is following procedural oriented approach is called as procedural oriented language. For example, C language. Using the C language, we can develop any project. If we develop the project using C language, we are following procedural oriented approach. I guess you are all understand and basic knowledge of procedural oriented approach. Procedural oriented approach is nothing but in that program or in that project we have only procedures and methods, that is called procedural oriented approach. But in this procedural oriented approach we have some limitations. The limitations are: one is no modularity, second one is no reusability the code, and third one is no security. So if we will use the any procedural language, for example C language, like that, we have some limitations. Those limitations are these three basically main limitations: no reusability, no security, no modularity. But to overcome these limitations, to overcome these above limitations, a new approach was introduced, that is called object oriented programming approach. To overcome these three limitations, it was introduced another programming approach, that is called object oriented programming approach. So object oriented program approach is, in object oriented approach the program is a collection of classes. So in object oriented programming approach we will develop, or that approach will contain collection of classes. The second point in the object oriented approach is a programming language which will follow object oriented approach is called as a object oriented programming language. For example, C++ language, Java language, and C#.NET and VB. These all programming languages are under object oriented programming approach. So in that object oriented programming approach will contain the collection of classes and objects. So whenever we are developing a project or a program, in that program, in the group of statements, wherever we will use the classes and object, that is called object oriented approach, object oriented programming approach. So object oriented approach is a programming methodology by providing the programs using classes and objects. Whenever we are using classes and objects in our project, that methodology called object oriented programming approach. A programming language which will have follow object oriented approach is called object oriented approach. These are the examples. So here friends, what we learn here is, in this slide, what are the programming approaches in the project while developing any code. So here we have two approaches. One is procedural oriented approach and another one is object oriented approach. What is the procedural oriented approach? What are the limitations of procedural oriented approach? What is the one of the example for procedural oriented approach? Another approach is object oriented approach, object oriented programming approach. So what is the object oriented approach and what will be contained in this approach? How we will declare whether it is a object oriented programming approach or procedural oriented approach? So what are the examples of object oriented approach languages, programming languages? So these basic details, basic understanding of programming approaches we have learned in this slide. So we will go for next slide. So here it is. Here we can see object oriented programming system principles. So what are the principles? That means, to recognize a programming language as a object oriented programming language, we have four principles which are called as OOPS, object oriented programming system. So to recognize a programming language as a object oriented programming, to recognize whether it is object oriented programming or procedural oriented programming, whether it is a procedural oriented programmer or object oriented program, to recognize that we have four principles. That principles are encapsulation, abstraction, inheritance and polymorphism. If a programming language is following above four principles, then that programming language is called as object oriented programming language. Whenever we are writing any program using any programming language, in that program, if we follow the above principles, that means these are the above principles: encapsulation, abstraction, inheritance and polymorphism. If we follow these four principles in your programming while using C++, or Java, C#, and VB, any programming language, that is called object oriented programming approach. So these programming languages are following above principles. Due to that reason, which are called as object oriented language. To achieve the above four principles, every object oriented programming language will use two concepts, that is, those are class and object. To fulfill, to complete, to achieve these principles, encapsulation, abstraction, inheritance and polymorphism, we have to use these two concepts, that is called class and object. So that is the friends, class and object. What is the class? Class is collection of states and behaviors. And what is the state? So class is nothing but collection of states and behaviors. Okay, here what is the state? So here state is a member of a class. State is a member of a class which represents some values. State can be called as variable of field. So in the programming we will declare the one variable in the class. That variable we consider as a state. So that collection of variables and collection of behaviors are a class. Another one, when we will go for a state, when we will go for state. State is nothing but a variable in the class. So when we will go, when we will use, when we want that state, that variable, whenever we want to represent some value, whenever we want to represent some value in our program while developing any project, that time we will go for a state. That is the state and that is the class. That is the friends. I hope you are understand the basic principles of the object oriented programming, and early in the previous slide, procedural oriented approach and object oriented approach. I hope you are understand some basic idea in these slides. Thanks friends. Thank you for your spending your valuable time to watch this video. Please subscribe if you like this video. If you like this video, if you learn something from this video for your valuable time, just like this video, share and subscribe. If you like this video, please subscribe to your friends, then you can see some more additional and useful videos on later. Thank you. And if you would like to give any comments on the video, please give your comments below the video. Then I will go through those comments and I will learn, I will understand, I will give comments, I will give respond to your reply, your comments. Thank you. Thanks.